All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we are diving into one of the most fascinating periods in American history, the California Gold Rush.
That's right. We're going to be going beyond just the, surface level stories of striking it rich and panning for gold.
Right, I think everyone knows the basic story of the gold rush, but I think what's interesting is, we're going to be looking at like the social and political impact.
The ripple effects.
Yeah, the ripple effects of this event, and we're going to be using some really interesting sources.
Yes, we are.
So we've got diaries and letters.
First-hand accounts from people who were actually there.
And it's really interesting to see the gold rush through their eyes.
And we've also got some government documents and legal proceedings to give us that bigger picture context.
Yeah, so if you are interested in American history, in the this period of westward expansion and how it really shaped the nation.
And how we got to where we are today.
Make sure you subscribe to the deep dive because we're going to be unpacking all of this and more.
So to kick things off, let's transport ourselves back to 1850
Okay.
to Sacramento, California. Picture this. The city's absolutely jam-packed with people from all walks of life,
All right.
all chasing the dream of striking it rich.
I can only imagine. I mean, from what I've read, it was absolute chaos.
Chaos is an understatement. The streets were a muddy mess,
Oh, I bet.
overflowing with garbage, and there were even, get this, dead animals just lying around.
Oh my gosh, that's just
Not exactly the glamorous image you see in the movies.
not a very romantic picture, no, but it was real life for the folks who were there.
It was, and it got even worse in January of 1850 when a massive flood hit Sacramento.
Oh yeah, I read about that. The Sacramento and American rivers overflowed, didn't they?
They did. The entire city was basically submerged underwater.
Wow.
And it's estimated that thousands of people lost their homes and businesses.
Devastating, just devastating. I came across this account from a family, the Roy family.
Oh, yes, I know the story.
They were caught in the flood.
Josiah, Sarah, and their daughter Mary.
Yes, and they ended up taking refuge in a half-built building with 50 other people.
Just imagine, huddled together, water rising all around them.
It's hard to even fathom the fear and uncertainty they must have felt.
It really puts the hardships of the gold rush into perspective.
It really does. It wasn't all glitz and glamour, that's for sure.
Not at all. And the Roy family story is just one of many.
Right.
There were so many people who endured incredible hardship and risk in pursuit of their dream.
Well, it makes you wonder what drove them.
Right. Was it just the gold?
Yeah.
Or was there something more?
I mean, you have to have a certain amount of, I don't know, maybe a little craziness to...
To leave everything behind and head out to the unknown
Yeah.
and risk it all.
We actually have a letter from a miner named Abraham Abramson.
Oh, yes. His letter is quite insightful.
He talks about the harsh realities of life in the gold fields.
And he debunks some of the myths. He says, those who expect roast pigeons flying around on golden wings just waiting to be plucked and eaten.
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious.
They'd stay right where they are.
A dose of reality there, right?
A big one, so it definitely wasn't all sunshine and roses.
No. It sounds like it was really tough, back-breaking work.
Absolutely.
And it wasn't always successful.
Definitely not. In fact, most people didn't strike it rich.
I imagine it took a lot of ingenuity and resilience.
Oh, definitely. And speaking of ingenuity,
Yes.
I have to tell you about Porter Rockwell,
Okay, this is the Mormon gunslinger, right?
the one and only.
Yeah, I've heard some interesting stories about him.
Well, he realized that he could make a pretty good living by catering to the miners' needs,
Oh,
rather than trying to find gold himself.
interesting.
So he decided to, wait for it,
Okay.
load up his mules with barrels of whiskey
Okay.
and create a mobile saloon.
Whoa, like a traveling bar.
Exactly.
That's brilliant.
And he would travel to the remote mining camps and attract customers with, get this,
Oh, God.
gunshots.
Wow. Talk about a marketing strategy.
All right.
That's amazing. But, while some people were finding success like Porter Rockwell, the impact on the Native American population was devastating.
It was a very dark chapter,
Yeah, miners encroached on their land,
displacing them from their homes
and there were conflicts over resources,
and cultural clashes.
leading to violence and tragedy.
We have an account from a miner named Silas Weston.
Oh, right. He participated in a raid on a Native American village.
Yes, his account is very disturbing.
I bet.
He describes the violence in graphic detail.
It's a reminder that this period of westward expansion came at a great cost.
Absolutely.
But amidst the chaos and conflict, California was also becoming a very diverse place.
It was a melting pot like no other.
I mean, you had people coming from all over the world.
All drawn by the promise of gold and a new life.
And each group brought their own cultures and traditions.
It was a truly unique mix of people.
We have the story of Mifflin Gibbs, for example.
Oh, yes, Mifflin Gibbs. He was a successful African-American carpenter.
Right, and he faced a lot of discrimination despite his accomplishments.
He did. He was even forced to abandon his trade because white workers refused to work alongside him.
It's a sad reminder that racism and prejudice were still very much present.
Even in a place that was supposed to be a land of opportunity.
And it wasn't just African Americans.
No.
Jewish merchants also faced discrimination.
That's right. They were targeted with laws that put them at a disadvantage.
Like the Sunday closing laws, for example.
Exactly. Those laws required businesses to close on Sundays.
Which was the Christian Sabbath.
Right. So it forced Jewish merchants to either violate their own Sabbath or lose 2 days of business.
Unfair.
Very much so.
So you have this rapidly growing population, a diverse mix of cultures.
And a booming economy fueled by gold.
Right. But also this underlying tension and conflict.
Yes. It was a powder keg waiting to explode.
So it's no wonder that the need for a formal government became urgent. By 1849, California was in desperate need of some structure.
It was, and General Bennett Riley.
Who was the acting governor at the time.
Yes, he recognized this.
And he called for a constitutional convention.
That's right, a gathering of delegates to establish a framework for a new state government.
And this convention was held in Monterey in September of 1849.
Yes, and it's here where things get really interesting.
I bet, because they weren't just dealing with, creating a government for a new state.
Right.
They were also grappling with the issue of slavery.
Which was tearing the nation apart.
And that was a huge, huge dilemma.
Absolutely.
That would have major consequences for the future of the country.
No doubt about it, the stakes were incredibly high.
So how did they even begin to tackle such a monumental task?
Well, the delegates represented a wide range of backgrounds and viewpoints.
Oh, I'm sure.
And they faced some really tough decisions.
I can only imagine. And the biggest question of all
was whether California would enter the Union as a free state or a slave state.
Right. And that decision would have a ripple effect throughout the entire nation.
It would shape the course of American history.
So let's dive into those debates and see how it all unfolded.
Let's do it. And, it's amazing to think about this. A lot of the delegates at this convention were actually from slaveholding states.
Really?
Yeah. But in the end, they ended up voting to make California a free state.
Huh. That's fascinating. I wonder what led to that shift in thinking.
Well, I think the unique circumstances of the gold rush played a big role, you see.
How so?
Well, think about it. The gold rush was all about individual effort and opportunity.
Yeah.
People were coming from all over, hoping to strike it rich, and they relied on their own hard work, and wage labor was really important.
Right.
So in that environment, slavery just didn't make as much sense.
So it was more about practicality than morality at that point.
In some ways, yes. I mean, there were certainly moral arguments against slavery being made.
Of course.
But for a lot of people, it just wasn't economically viable in the context of the gold rush.
Right, because you needed people to be able to move freely and work for wages.
Exactly. We even have a quote from a guy named John Milner.
Okay.
He was a former slave owner from Alabama.
Okay.
And he said, and I quote, "With 20 good Negroes and the power of managing them as at home, I could make from $10,000 to $20,000 per month. But here, a fellow has to knock it out with his own fists or not at all."
Wow. That's pretty telling.
It is. It shows how the gold rush really flipped the script on traditional labor system.
Absolutely. But even though California decided to be a free state, there were still efforts to exclude black people altogether, weren't there?
Yeah, there were. A delegate named Morton McCarver, he was really adamant about keeping black people out of California.
Oh, wow.
He actually proposed an exclusion clause.
No way.
Several times.
Really?
Yeah, but thankfully each time it was voted down.
That's good, but it's still troubling that those sentiments were even present,
Oh, absolutely. It's a reminder that progress isn't always a straight line.
Yeah, no kidding.
Even in a place like California, with all its talk of opportunity, there were still these deeply ingrained prejudices.
And it wasn't just limited to race either.
No, it wasn't.
There were also debates about religious freedom.
Right, particularly for Jewish merchants.
Yeah, those Sunday closing laws seem pretty discriminatory in hindsight.
Oh, they were. It basically forced Jewish merchants to choose between their religious beliefs and their livelihoods.
Not really a choice at all, is it?
Not a fair one.
Well, speaking of fairness, what about women's rights during this time.
Oh, that's interesting. There were actually some surprisingly progressive discussions about women's rights at the convention.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the secretary of the convention, Henry Halleck, he was a big advocate for women's property rights.
Okay.
He argued that women shouldn't lose control of their property just because they got married.
That's pretty radical for that time period.
It was, and he even suggested that giving women more rights would make California more attractive to them.
Interesting. So he was thinking about the practical implications as well.
Absolutely. He saw the gender imbalance in California as a problem, and he thought that by empowering women...
They would be more likely to come to the state.
Exactly.
Makes sense. It's amazing how even amidst all the chaos and gold fever, they were thinking about these fundamental issues of equality.
It really speaks to the complex and contradictory nature of the gold rush era.
Right. You have this drive for individual wealth and opportunity clashing with these traditional prejudices and societal norms.
It was a time of tremendous change and upheaval, and you can really see that reflected in the debates at the Constitutional Convention.
So the delegates finish drafting the Constitution,
Mm-hmm.
Californians ratify it, and boom, they're ready to become a state, right?
Well, not so fast.
Oh, what happened?
Getting that Constitution approved by Congress turned out to be a whole other battle.
I bet, because California applying for statehood, especially as a free state,
Yeah.
that threw a wrench into the whole national debate about slavery.
Oh, yeah, it was like adding fuel to the fire.
I mean, the country was already on edge.
Absolutely. Tensions were running high, and California's push for statehood just pushed things even closer to the breaking point.
So what was the reaction back east when news of California's proposed constitution reached Washington?
Well, President Zachary Taylor, he was in office at the time,
Okay.
and even though he was a slave owner from Louisiana,
Okay.
he actually supported California's right to choose.
Huh. That's surprising.
It was. He urged Congress to admit California as quickly as possible, saying that delaying it would just make things worse.
So he was trying to be a voice of reason amidst all the chaos.
He was. He knew how delicate the situation was.
But did Congress listen to him?
Well, not really. Congress was completely divided.
As per usual.
Exactly. They were more concerned with their own agendas and political maneuvering.
And the issue of slavery just dominated everything, right?
Absolutely, especially when it came to the new territories.
Like California.
Exactly.
So what happened? Did they just keep arguing and getting nowhere?
Well, that's when Henry Clay stepped in.
Ah, the great compromiser.
That's him.
I mean, he was famous for trying to find common ground between the North and the South.
He was. He was a master negotiator, and he knew that something had to be done to prevent the Union from falling apart.
So what did he propose?
Well, on January 29th, 1850, he presented his grand plan to Congress, a compromise plan with 8 key points.
Okay, 8 points. That sounds complicated.
It was, but essentially he was trying to offer something to both sides, hoping to appease everyone enough to avoid a full-blown crisis.
All right, well, let's break it down. What were some of the main points of this compromise?
Well, first and foremost, he advocated for admitting California as a free state.
Okay, so that was a big win for the abolitionists.
It was, but to balance that out, he proposed organizing the New Mexico and Utah territories without specifically mentioning slavery.
Ah, so he was leaving that decision up to the people who live there.
Exactly. It was called popular sovereignty.
Right, and that was a very controversial concept because it could potentially lead to more slave states.
It could, and that's why both sides saw it as a gamble.
But he was basically trying to kick the can down the road on that issue, right?
You could say that.
And what else did he propose?
Well, he also suggested allowing Texas to carve out new slave states within its existing borders, and he even offered federal funds to pay off Texas's debt.
Wow, that was a big concession to the South.
It was, but he felt it was necessary to keep them on board.
I see. And what about the slave trade in Washington, D.C.? Wasn't that a big issue as well?
It was, and while Clay didn't propose abolishing it outright, he did suggest moving it out of public view, relocating it across the river to Virginia.
So, a bit of a symbolic gesture, I guess.
You could say that it was a way to acknowledge the moral concerns of the North without completely alienating the South.
Right, and then there's the Fugitive Slave Act.
Ah, yes, that was the most controversial part of the whole compromise.
Because it made it much easier for slave owners to capture runaway slaves.
It did, even if they had escaped to free states.
And that was a huge point of contention in the North.
Absolutely. It outraged a lot of people who saw it as a violation of basic human rights.
So this compromise, which was supposed to bring the country together,
Yeah.
Seems like it actually ended up creating even more division.
It did in some ways. It forced people to confront the issue of slavery head on, and there was no easy answer.
So how did it all play out? Did Clay's grand plan actually work?
Well, it's a long story.
I
But
bet.
to make a long story short, it was a mixed bag.
In what way?
Well, Clay's omnibus bill, which included all 8 points of the compromise, it faced a lot of opposition in Congress.
I can imagine.
Abolitionists hated the strengthened Fugitive Slave Act,
Yeah.
and Southern firebrands like Jefferson Davis, he was furious about the whole thing.
Oh, wow.
He saw it as an attack on the South's way of life.
So it was a stalemate. Nobody was happy.
Pretty much, and then things took a dramatic turn.
What happened?
President Taylor, who had been sick for a while, he died suddenly in July of 1850.
Oh, wow. So what happened then?
Well, his vice president, Millard Fillmore, he became president.
Okay. And was he more open to compromise than Taylor?
He was. He was much more eager to find a solution, any solution, to prevent the country from splitting apart.
So he saw the urgency of the situation.
He did, and that shift in leadership really changed the game.
Interesting how something like that can have such a huge impact.
It really can. History is full of these turning points.
So did Fillmore manage to get Clay's plan passed?
Well, not exactly. The omnibus bill as a whole, it still couldn't get through Congress.
Oh, wow.
But then this young senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas, he stepped in.
Okay. And what did he do?
Well, he realized that the problem with the omnibus bill was that it was trying to do too much at once.
Okay.
So he decided to break it up.
Break it up.
Yeah, he presented each part of the compromise as a separate bill.
Interesting. So divide and conquer.
Exactly, and that strategy actually worked.
Really?
Yeah, he was able to build different coalitions for each issue, getting support from both sides of the aisle.
Wow, that's some pretty savvy political maneuvering.
It was. And in the end, each component of the Compromise of 1850 was passed into law.
Including California's admission as a free state,
Yes.
but also that strengthened Fugitive Slave Act.
Right.
So it's kind of a bittersweet victory.
It is. It's a complicated legacy.
Absolutely. So how did the nation react to this whole series of compromises? Was it seen as a success or a failure?
Well, it depends on who you ask. Some people praised it as a triumph of statesmanship.
Right.
They saw it as a way to save the Union.
Okay.
But others were furious. They saw it as a betrayal, especially the Fugitive Slave Act.
Yeah, I can see that.
It really highlighted the deep divisions in the country.
So did the Compromise of 1850 actually achieve its goal? Did it really prevent a civil war?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
It certainly delayed things, but it also exposed the deep cracks in the nation's foundation.
Cracks that would only continue to widen in the years to come.
Exactly.
You know, it's amazing to think that something like the discovery of gold could have such a huge impact on the entire course of history.
It really is. It just shows how interconnected everything is.
Like a domino effect.
Exactly. You have this seemingly isolated event in California, and it ends up triggering all these other events.
That have a ripple effect across the entire nation.
And even beyond.
And it really forced America to confront some really tough questions about its own identity.
Like, what does it mean to be a free country?
Yeah.
What about equality? What about the rights of individuals?
And of course, the issue of slavery just looms over everything.
It does. It's the elephant in the room.
We saw how California's decision to be a free state really rattled the South.
Oh, absolutely. They saw it as a threat, like the beginning of the end.
And it really played into their fears about losing power and influence.
Right, and ultimately about the survival of their way of life.
Right. I mean, their whole economy was based on slavery.
It was, and they
Yeah.
couldn't imagine a world without it.
Which brings us back to John C. Calhoun.
That staunch defender of the South.
He had that really ominous prediction, didn't he?
He did. He basically said the Union was doomed.
Like it was just a matter of time before it all fell apart.
Yeah, he believed that the North and the South were just too different, too divided.
And that they could never truly coexist peacefully.
And, looking back, it's chilling how accurate his prediction turned out to be.
Yeah, I mean, the Compromise of 1850 might have bought them some time.
But it didn't address the root cause of the problem.
Which was slavery.
Exactly. And the Fugitive Slave Act, that was a real turning point.
Because it really brought the horrors of slavery home to the North.
It did. It made it impossible to ignore.
I mean, before that, a lot of Northerners could just kind of turn a blind eye to what was happening in the South.
Right. It was out of sight, out of mind.
But the Fugitive Slave Act forced them to confront the reality of slavery.
And to take a stand.
And I think that's one of the most important legacies of this era.
Absolutely. It pushed the nation closer to a reckoning.
A point where those fundamental questions about freedom and equality could no longer be ignored.
And it set the stage for the Civil War.
Yeah, which is just heartbreaking when you think about it.
It is, but it's also a reminder that progress often comes at a cost.
So looking back at this tumultuous period, what lessons can we learn?
Well, I think it shows us that history is never simple.
Right, it's not just a neat and tidy progression of events.
There are always these complexities, these contradictions.
And sometimes, even the best intentions can lead to unintended consequences.
Like the Compromise of 1850.
It was meant to prevent war.
But it ended up paving the way for it.
I guess it's a reminder that there are no easy answers.
And that the fight for justice is ongoing.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Yes, it's been a fascinating journey.
We've covered a lot of ground today.
From the muddy streets of Sacramento
To the halls of Congress.
and we've seen how the California Gold Rush
Really shook the nation to its core.
and set in motion the events that would lead to the Civil War.
So if you've enjoyed this deep dive into history, make sure you subscribe to this show.
And join us next time as we explore another fascinating chapter from the past.
Thanks for listening.